In this video, we are going to learn about the alert controller. An alert is just a dialog that presents user with some information, or it is used to collect information from the user using input fields. Alert, like all other overlay components, also appears on top of the app's content. And it also requires that the user dismisses the alert if they want to continue interacting with the application. As long as the alert is displayed, the user is not able to interact with the rest of the application. And to display an alert, we use the alert controller. So here we are inside Visual Studio Code where we left off in the last video. And the first thing we'll do is create a third button in our application, which we will use to invoke a function that will in turn display an alert to the user. So here I have created a new button and I'll change the text on the button to click me for alert, and I'll also change the name of the function to which the click event of this button is bound. So I'll change the name of the function to show alert. Let's save that, and just like that we get this new button in our application. Next, we need to go to our home.page.ts file and create this new function. So just as we created the show loading and show toast functions, we will be creating the show alert function. Now that we have created the show alert function, we need to bring in the alert controller. So step 1, we'll import the alert controller from @ionic/angular package. Step 2 would be to inject the alert controller into this class by passing it as a parameter to our constructor. I'll name the instance as alert CTRL. However, you can name it whatever you want, and this is going to be of the type alert controller. So now that we have the alert CTRL object, we can use it to display an alert to the user. Let's start with the basic alert. To do that, we will type in this .alertcontroller.create, and the create function here takes in a JSON object. And this JSON object can contain key value pairs that define the content and behavior of the alert controller. So before we start defining the properties inside the create function, let's make the show alert function asynchronous, and we'll store the returned value of the create function inside an object called alert, and we'll use the await keyword because the create function returns a promise. Finally, we'll use the alert.present function to display this alert to the user. Now we can go ahead and define all the properties for this alert controller. The first property that you can pass in is the header, and header requires a string that is displayed on the top of the alert. The font size of the header, as you would expect, is larger than anything on your alert. So let's go ahead and type in something like "Are you sure?" And the second property is going to be subheader. This is also a string, and the font size will be smaller than that of the header. So let's go ahead and type in some text here, and then we are going to pass in a property called message, which is supposed to contain longer strings. So if you have a message that you want to display to the user, you can pass that in to the message property. I have passed in a long string to the message property. Next, we'll be passing in a property called buttons, and the buttons property defines all the buttons that you want to have in your alert. The buttons property takes in an array, and each object inside this array defines one of the buttons of your alert. So inside this array, we'll pass in a JSON object, and the first property that I'm going to define for the first button is the text. So I'll just go ahead and type in the text cancel. And the second property that you can pass in for a button is the handler. And this is the function that is executed when this button is tabbed. So that completes our first button, and I'll put in a comma inside the array and define the second button, which is again going to be a JSON object. On this button as well, I'll define the text, and the text is going to be delete. And I'll also define a handler for this second button as well. And this will be executed when the user taps on the delete button. So now that we have a header, subheader, message, and two buttons, We can go ahead and test this out. So let's save the file and let's click on the third button inside our application to display the alert. And you can see that I get this beautiful alert which has the header, "Are you sure?" And below that we have the subheader followed by the message. I have two buttons, cancel and delete, and you can click on either of the buttons to dismiss this alert. If you tap on the cancel button, the handler for the cancel button will be executed, and if you tap on the delete button, the handler for the delete button will be executed. So now that you know how you can create an alert with buttons, let's learn how you can add input fields to this alert. So right after the message property here, I will go ahead and define a property called inputs, which is again going to be an array. And each object inside this array will define one of the inputs for your alert. So I'll just go ahead and define the first one. The first property is going to be name. And you have to pass in a name if you want to retrieve the value of this input field in one of your buttons handlers. So let's give this first input field a name, and let's give it a name called username. The second property that we are going to define for this input field is going to be type, and here you can see that you have so many options for the type of the input that you can have. For now, I'm just going to have a simple text input, so the type will contain the value text. I'll also define a placeholder value, and the placeholder text will be displayed inside the input field when the user has not entered anything in that input field. So let's go ahead and type in something here. And just like we have defined this first input field, I'll just go ahead and copy that and define my second input field. In this case, the name is going to be email, the type is also going to be email, and the placeholder value is also going to be something like that. Let's save that and see how our alert looks like. Now I'll go ahead and click on the third button to display the alert. And you can see that along with the header, subheader, and message, and the buttons that we previously had, we now have two input fields, and the first input field displays the placeholder value, which is what we have defined here, and so does the second input field. Let's go ahead and enter some value inside these fields and click on delete, and the alert dismisses. So we are able to add input fields to our alert, but before concluding this lesson, let's understand how we can get the values that the user has entered in these input fields. To do that, you will have to use your handler functions that you have on your buttons. So let's say that if the user taps on cancel, we don't want to do anything. But if the user taps on the delete button, we need the values of these username and email fields. To do that, all you have to do is just pass in a parameter to your handler function, and for now we'll just log it to the console, and this object that you have passed in as a parameter to your handler function will contain the value of both these input fields. Keep in mind that you have to define a name for your input field if you want to retrieve its value in one of your handler functions. If you have not defined the name, you will not be able to get its value inside the parameter in your handler function. So now let's go ahead and check this out. I'll open the alert and I'll enter some text inside this alert. And before I hit the delete button, I'll open the console in my browser. So I'll open the Chrome options, select More Tools, and click on Developer Tools. And here you can see that I have the browser's console opened. I'll click on this button to clear the console, and now I don't have anything inside my console. Now I'll just go ahead and tap on the delete button and see if I get some logs inside this console. And you can see that as I tapped on the delete button, I get a JSON object logged to the console which contains a property called email, which is equal to the value of the email text that we entered inside our alert, and similarly we have a username that also contains the text that we entered in the input field for the username. And that's how the alert works. You can have all kinds of input fields, and for dates and numbers, you can also set the minimum and maximum value using the min and max properties. Feel free to play around with different types of input fields and buttons in your alerts. So now that you know how you can create and display alerts in your application, in the next video we'll learn how we can create new pages and implement navigation within an Ionic application.